There's something quietly unsettling about realizing just how deeply we're shaped by a mix of our essence and the environment that forced us to survive. It's like wrestling with a psychological Rubik's Cube, where every twist reveals another hidden side of who we are and what we've mistaken for truth. Sometimes the very systems you turn to for healing are the ones holding you back, gently suffocating your recovery without ever revealing their grip. It took real intensity, clearing out pharmaceuticals, gritting through the physical agony of a cleanse, feeling my body demand a new way forward to finally glimpse the patterns that had me pinned in place. That moment, almost a decade ago, shifted everything. I saw a path opening up, a rare vision, as if the familiar mixture of pain and habit was finally fading enough for me to see another way. I'm Mark Roach. Welcome to Transcendent, my platform for diving into authenticity and, if you're willing, for helping you uncover your own uniqueness and your essence. My perspective is often uncomfortable. The path that shaped me was twisted, crossing cultures and ideas that most people avoid. But it all started in the hills of the Ozarks, molded by diligent parents and grandparents with a Native American roots and a powerful, heartfelt outlook. Yeah, I was ambitious, yes, and life gave me highs and lows. This space here is for ordinary people who are ready to find their power and step into their uniqueness and challenge maybe what they've been told about themselves, their environment, and their limits, and how things work. My life became a research lab. I spent years studying mystics. I left a path to the NFL behind when I couldn't conform to shallow or a violent world based on materialism. And I ended up doing much of that. I founded oil companies. I raised billions for startups. I also raised 8 kids during that process. I've led thousands in engineering and geology, and I've been mentored by legends in business and in sports. All while I've been peeling back the layers of my own personal trauma in an effort for self-discovery. And I'm here to try to help anyone. Maybe you're dealing with complex PTSD, or you've been called forth for something important in your life by of your own accord or by a friend or family member. But you sense there's an urge for authenticity, or perhaps in supporting someone else to help them find their way. Now, think for a moment how identity gets tangled up with any commercial pressure tugging at your vanity and ego. I mean, beneath all the noise, materialism, the nonstop pursuit of popularity, a strange kind of power ties to keep the ego at the center. Neuroscience and the study of trauma laid out the tracks for my recovery, but I found what's missing in most approaches is rarely something that you control. So a touch of grace, a flash of genuine connection, the unexpected, maybe prayer, maybe just the mysterious force that Jesus embodied or described. Most would prefer to rely on intellect, stacking up drama and old biases, mistaking fear for truth in a world obsessed with conflict and watching debate and podcasts, all for commerce. To truly heal, transcendence has to be in the room, and the ego must be absent. If that's no easy task, it turns out the key isn't knowing everything, it's actually realizing how little is actually known. Neuroscience backs it up. We function with about a 5% awareness at best. The minute we pretend to have all the answers, we're stuck repeating history cycles. We wage war, we debate these dominance games that we play, just dressed in fresh clothing, maybe cast a new way, given a new name, while the real essence gets lost in the psychological scramble. When I fully embraced feeling, sitting with pain, tracing memories, using EMDR's rhythmic eye movements, I found the 100 blocks in my mind that they could be dissolved. And the journey after that required patience and a kind of surrender. My patterns weren't embedded, or they were embedded deeper than I ever understood, or any of my therapists or counselors or anybody around me. They were rooted in my body and my bones and demanded a long and very unpredictable process, more like drifting than setting a destination and arriving. It's kind of like Abraham setting off for an unknown land back in the Bible. The destination remained elusive. And most of what makes up reality will remain unknown. So I heard a so-called expert say in a podcast that we don't have time to figure out who we really are. So just follow the crowd. Maybe that works for some, but it makes me want to step back, clear away the noise, and release anyone drawn to this space towards their essence and point you toward your destiny. It could be really rich and good. But the choice is yours, and nothing about my journey is designed to instruct or dominate or close doors. My hope is that if there's any prescription here, is to help you experience your own path, unchained by conditioning, open to what's real and authentic. I'm Mark Roach. This is Transcendent, wishing you all the best. Now, I wanted to do something a little different following that more curated delivery. And what I'm going to do is I want to talk about exactly what really helped me about 10 years ago. Now, if you've been following the Gurdjieff work that I've been publishing for personal development, you may see this theme repeated of separating from your conditioning, which is a kind of like a psychological rubrics cube. And that's what's so difficult about self-development is the psychological patterns of seeing progress, seeing reality, getting feedback, keeping track of your progress, staying conscious and putting forth the effort. I see this as a real blessing, was my Christian upbringing. And I had this faith and this clear view that, as I see it, of Jesus that was so different from the standard view that I saw from a lot of the pulpits where people were preaching and speaking of him. I really saw like the Sermon on the Mount being his beautiful message to mankind that 2,000 years ago, he came to change the way things worked. And he delivered a message to people around him that has been recorded. And, without knocking some of the scriptures and the institutions and people that worked with all the documents that were left behind by people that were kind of making records of what was happening. I think a lot of that was reconstructing some of the patterns that existed prior to his coming for some influence that he left behind. But I don't know that anyone, maybe until these days, is having a chance to really see all that for what it is, because his words are especially beautiful for me, and I've been working with them my entire life, trying to reconcile some of the differences between how they're being implemented in our lives today, and how psychology is so active, and thank goodness for some of the neuroscience that's been coming out, because as I've followed some of that research, it's really helped me get clear on some of the differences between spirituality and some of the patterns that we have in our conditioning and in our society that we all operate from, and how some of us are really built for the spiritual and not built as well for some of the rules that are being operated on in society. So I found myself in the camp of, some of the food that I was eating, some of the, I mean, although I could dominate in sports and athletics, as I got into it and considered it as a, potential profession, I found my heart had nothing, that it didn't identify with that. And so many of us, will battle, this identity that's formed early on. And well, your identity is so enmeshed in the mix of your essence and the environment that programmed you to survive here. And that's a good thing and it's a bad thing, because that early childhood programming, we're trying to pick up patterns that we can use to live by. And that's the way, I mean, that's the human nature, is that in the first early childhood, maybe the first, 5, 6, 7 years, that's where we basically have a lot of subconscious rules that are kind of owned by our body, by the organism, by the bioform that we carry for the rest of our lives. And we don't have to think about our heartbeat. We don't have to think about our breath. And much of our system, operates on autopilot. And unfortunately, a lot of the rules and a lot of the thinking that we work from is also operating on some autopilot. So, the blend of the human condition and this commercialism can be used to exploit your ego and your vanity, and they're powerful forces. Now, the turning point for me was when I'd finally cleared out, all the, I was diagnosed with some problems because I suddenly was immobile due to a knee injury from playing basketball. And I ended up getting put on pharmaceuticals because I was suddenly depressed. And then I continued taking those. And those pharmaceuticals really led me toward a path of conforming to a lifestyle in Kingwood, Texas at the time, in a part of Houston, and really building a life that had nothing to do with who I really was, except, I was expressing some of my core values, but it was very frustrating because on one hand I was trying to serve two masters. One was the spiritual, or what I consider to be the path toward my divine purpose, and another path that was more toward materialism and creature comforts. And it was a very divided time for me. And ultimately, I was cast out of that materialistic society with a vengeance, because I was, I believe that there was a heavy hand of my spirit calling me toward transcendence, and to create some of this material ultimately to share with other people. So, I was doing some really strong physical cleanses to get all those pharmaceuticals out of my body. I was fasting and, eliminating some of the kind of the hangover or the half-life of the effects of those pharmaceuticals that I took for several years, that were trying to embed me into a lifestyle and a physiology that this organism that I'm speaking from was not having anything to do with. So but I used, my early childhood experience around willpower, exercise, athleticism, as well as some of the techniques that my father shared with me from his psychology, his advanced studies in psychology and hypnosis and visualization and memorization, observation. And he was an incredible detective. And so I watched all that and just soaked all that up like a sponge in my early childhood. And as I was kind of recovering from the basically getting kicked out of Kingwood and the lifestyle and the companies that I had built, um, I was, I started fasting and I started doing this exercise and doing some intense self-observation. And I figured out that the very help that was available on the surface was actually keeping me suppressing the elements that were needed for my recovery. That may sound weird, but let me tell you, I walked into a nonprofit where there were some really well-trained individuals who were there to greet me, and I was there really to offer my help with their the nonprofit efforts that they were providing the community. And but the first question that they asked me was, what do I want? What do I want? What do I want to do? And if any of you have PTSD or complex PTSD, one of the difficult things is getting access to your wants, to really know your desires. And I was there and I couldn't say this clearly at the time. So their question of what do I want really just made me hurt more because that question somehow was it was kind of like they were asking me, who do you want to be? What do you want to accomplish in the world? And it was more of a commercial or what kind of things would make you happy? And I wasn't pursuing happiness, so to speak. I was pursuing relief from the pain that I'd been carrying all my life. And so these well-trained people, even I've had a number of therapists that I've worked with and interviewed over the years who were kind of entertained by the things that I was achieving in my life and the stories that I would bring into the room. And although I'm not really an entertainer, I think I'm using story and have become a storyteller to try to communicate some of the deeper truths that I've stumbled across in my life and share those with others for your benefit. So I was at this place and when I figured out that they were asking me the exact questions that were causing me pain, I started exploring that more and more. And I ended up developing a vision of what I needed to get better. And it wasn't to to try to uncover more information about the pain that was the origin of my pain. I think I really focused and found that, and it wasn't something that I wanted to bury in escapism or in achievement or in trying to be to try to have a claim for something or write another book to talk about something or to achieve anything other than my internal victory would be to understand what it's like to be on the other side of that pain. And so that was my objective. And I had this vision of getting there, not from the traditional, counseling methods and talking about it more or anything like that. But I'd been doing a lot of work over the years in film acting, and I had a lot of feedback from, groups, made a few small films, and had a great acting coach from LA that was also a director, and he coached some movie stars that you've heard of, and you've seen some movies that he was a part of. And he was a father figure to me. And so but I was learning not to be an actor, but actually to use the circumstances that were artificially created in film and in theater and actually we were just doing workshops. It was just training with other actors and directors to get to the bottom of certain um, circumstances and feelings and some barriers that I was feeling. And a lot of actors do this. They use that space, of having a contrived scene that's going to be executed, but they allow themselves to feel through it to learn more about what's really going on in them and in their environment and with others that they may be doing the scene with. So I'd used that, and I knew that what I needed to do, which I ended up telling someone at this nonprofit, was that I need to find a therapist that can hear my story, that's not going to get overly impressed with my story, but will just allow me to feel deeply into the pains and some of the losses that I have, because a lot of them were tied to a chain of events that were very similar patterns that were all repeating themselves. And I'd finally gotten to a vantage point where I was separated just enough that I could see that there were a series of crises that had occurred in my life over and over and over in different ways, with different characters, with different scenes, but they all had some of the same emotional components of some of the first trauma that I'd experienced as a kid. So I'd learned about this method called EMDR that had helped people who had been in the military in the 90s and were coming back from Desert Storm with trauma, and it was helping them deal with it. So let me jump out of my story real quick and just say, I studied about this EMDR, and I found that, like, let's say there's someone that had a very pristine upbringing, fine education, good values, no disconnect between mother and father, no divorce. There was kind of a lot of really comfort and support and safety in that early childhood years, supported by some accomplishment of healthy achievements in their high school and college life. And maybe they had healthy relationships around them, and they're 30 years old and they find themselves in war in the Middle East. And they end up experiencing trauma that they've never experienced before. And they come back from that experience broken and unable to cope. But it's clear that there was one, maybe two observations or instances, crises, traumatic experiences that had occurred that were clearly not related to anything, really in their character or in their value system, that they should feel bad about because they were on duty, and so this was kind of an isolated event that could be separated from the personal life that they had prior to this. And so the EMDR technology was applied to help them deal with these single events. And it became clear to me that those people were having some actual healing as they were applying the EMDR techniques, which is basically just an eye movement from left to right, that during a time when you're allowing yourself to feel back into that trauma that you experienced with some awareness and with enough courage to allow yourself to feel it, to allow your mind, the parts of your brain actually that were hardened during that traumatic experience, allow them to soften and to resume their normal function, and that tissue in your brain to recover from the stiffness, that the stress, that had entered into the uh, the flesh. So, if that seemed like a very distinct um, description to me, that this technology could allow the body to heal. And it involves left and right hemispheres of the brain. And the neuroscience can, if you're interested, I can send you to some sources for that. And then the breathing and comfort that you need to have during that process, the self-acceptance and the awareness and the ability to flash back into that are powerful tools. And I learned those through acting, and also, from some of the early work that I did with my father in visualization and hypnosis, allowed me and gave me some of the skills to be able to sit there and feel into that trauma fully that I had experienced originally, as well as several, times in my life when I ended up entering into similar crises or creating similar crises, to be able to feel back into those moments and those circumstances and allow my brain to heal, to soften. And that can be a scary place. And so um, I started to say I wouldn't recommend that everyone, just walk out and do it, but who am I to say? Because one of the greatest compliments that I think I've ever had was when I was getting a major college football scholarship, or I was getting recruited by everybody in the country. There was another kid in town who heard that I was doing it, and they said, "Well, if Roach can do it, I can do it." And that was a huge compliment to me. Some people might look at it like they were putting me down, but no, that's exactly the kind of message that I'd like to deliver. If I can do this with my humble beginnings and my whatever it is, and it leads to something that's worthy for others, that's great. So I haven't shut up about my story, and I'll keep talking probably till I die. But the formula that I'm describing here isn't just EMDR, and it's not just film acting to be able to own and feel your circumstances. The first clear experience with some of the Gurdjieff work and Jung and many of these masters suggests that observation is so critical. And then this neuroscience and research around trauma really laid the tracks into the core of recovery for me. And then, the missing element of recovery for a lot of people, because a lot of people, they'll take the early steps toward it. And sometimes this EMDR, which to me is kind of the magic bullet, because it's something where you can be very proactive with it. And occasionally, there have been recoveries that people have enjoyed that were just produced by life or by prayer or by some random element of healing. And, I think we'd all like to believe that healing is related to something that we might be able to control or repeat, or use some rules or some system to bring comfort to ourselves and to others. And, ultimately, it probably has some causality underlying that's related to the love or access to the supernatural that Jesus communicated 2,000 years ago. And let me tell you, however, once the ego and our underlying Greek and Roman mindsets around drama, conflict, and commerce enter the healing space, well, that space morphs into one where people, this day and age, who rely so heavily on intellect, on defending their biases, and really operate on fear mistaken for truth, that creates a vacuum in the room. And there will be no, well, there can be healing. I don't know. There's 95% of things that I don't really understand, and the 5% I do know, I try to talk about. And I've been all over the world, and I've also tried a lot of different things to become whole and get to the point that I could speak as confidently as I am right now about it. So that's where I'm coming from. But I think it's essential to have this transcendence to evoke a state where the ego is not in the room. And most people are going to find this challenging because most of us are wanting to be right. As some wise person mentioned yesterday in a men's group that I was involved in, we all defend ourselves, maybe sometimes even unknowingly. But understanding or realizing how little that we know is really so key. I used to work with a bunch of super smart, highly trained investment banker types who really tried to, and occasionally I'd lend out staff, for them to use, and they'd try to tell my staff, when you go in front of my people, my clients, never admit that you don't know anything, something. Always tell them you know all the answers, and they were trying to impress upon some of my staff to be well prepared when they went into the room. I don't fault that. But acting like you know when you don't is going to invariably sneak up and bite you. So being open to not knowing, that's supported by neuroscience today. As I said, we may know 5%, but if we act like we know it all, we're limiting, or we're limited to kind of a standard cause and effect that you've seen operating in the world today, where we repeat these patterns of war and just we put a fresh set of clothes on the old patterns, and we have these same old debates over and over again, and someone's trying to dominate the other person, and somebody walks away feeling like they won, but what did they really win? Really, they just held up that side of the binary and passed time, and it was entertaining. And in the meantime, the people who are really in enjoying life are often, maybe it's that 1%. They're back there in the boardroom. I've been back there with them, and they're watching people fight in the streets, and it's a distraction from their humanity, and it's really a waste of effort and time. So seeking that dominance in this psychological babble, and getting caught up in this Rubik's Cube will keep you in prison. So for me, feeling deeply into those memories, the circumstances and scenes, the discomfort and pain that I'd been steered to avoid, while guiding my eyes from left to right, back and forth, several minutes at a time, making notes. This EMDR became the turning point in my healing process, and it removed the physical blocks in my brain. There's people around me that will tell you back in 2015, 16, when I was doing this work, that they could see a marked change in me and I'll just say it felt like I went from a hardened to a natural state of operating. Now it's not over there, because there's been a long period of integration, escaping those old patterns that were programmed into my bones and body and it's more than a 7-year process. As some people are going to tell you, your cells rejuvenate every 7 years. That may be true, but the conditioning and the people around you and the circumstances around you may not allow change to happen that quick. I mean, think about the power of social support. Women were given the right to vote over 100 years ago. On paper, you could expect them to have claimed that power immediately and stepped into roles that had been lived by men. But no, it's still taking, generations for change to affect because of there's some operants in life around the social support or unsupport, that 95% unknown. Well, that stuff is powerful. And that's where I'm walking you with this EMDR. And by taking your ego out of the picture, that's how you get access to this unknown area where healing can occur, and there's freedom, and there is a new access to spirit that I believe we can open up the more of it, as more of us, go through this process. And someone on this path, you've got to be comfortable being adrift, because the destination is ultimately only loosely known. And I'll go back and reference, Abraham in the Old Testament of the Bible, and look at Hebrews. I think it's chapter 8 or 9, verse 8 or 9, where he talks about, you know, basically walking into his inheritance and really not knowing what to do. That is so mirroring or metaphorical to what we're discovering with the neuroscience today, confirming that, we don't even know 95% of the reality in which we live. And, I heard a podcast the other day where someone who's considered to be, kind of a marketing and advertising expert that's, works a lot with Google and social media, basically saying, look, we just don't have time to find out who we really are. Just pick something. Don't worry about your uniqueness. Follow what's popular, because that's going to be a lot easier and less risky. And who am I to say? I mean, I have to say, I'm not a fan of that approach, but like I said, who am I to say? And I'm not putting myself down when I say that. That's the ultimate freedom that I offer myself, to operate organically and freely in my life. I give myself a chance to go off the path that I'm on. And I find that I want to be on the path that I am describing here. But if I put myself in a prison, I'm not going to be happy. I choose freedom. And that's the freedom I'd like to illustrate for you in saying, who am I to say? Because it's not about me. It's really about you making that choice. And I'm here, and you're going to have, maybe more than one chance to execute this choice and experiment and live your own life and have your own journey and develop your own story. So who am I to say? And I'm just trying to step away and allow you direct access to your consciousness, to your choice, to the life that you could live, possibly to release you to experience more of your essence, maybe your destiny in a new way. I am Mark Roach, and this is Transcendent, wishing you all the best.